Hopes for a ceasefire and an end of war negotiation in the Russia-Ukraine war continue to fade as Russian preparations for large-scale operations intensifies. That's the situation that we're facing right now. As you recall, Trump came into office even before he had been inaugurated, saying that he's going to have this war over with in a day and he's going to have it negotiated. And then reality starts to set in, and the difficulties and the challenges begin to manifest themselves, and the time keeps dragging on. And he had Zelenskyy came to Washington, D.C. We had that big blow up in the Oval Office. Then there was some more bad blood that even happened subsequent to that, as comments were going back and forth between Trump and Zelenskyy. Trump gets on the phone with Vladimir Putin. They seem to have some indication that they're willing to have at least a partial ceasefire, a limited ceasefire. But now then, even that is starting to come into question. Apparently there was some agreement to it, but then there's no actual action on the ground. Meanwhile, the war continues to be fought on the ground. So there's a lot of things going on, especially militarily, on both sides of the line that are very relevant to this discussion today and where this war is headed. Some of the events, though, are actually not on the ground. Some of the things that are happening almost on camera off the battlefield may have as much relevance to where this war is headed as anything that you can physically see on the battlefield. There has been some increasing overt effort by the Russian side to directly tie the performance and the abilities of what the Soviet Union did in the Second World War, and by extension, Moscow, Russia, and they basically make those synonymous, and this current fight. And they've been picking up some steam. Here's something I want to show you this video was released today in Russia by Sergei Lavrov, who's making a very direct connection between those two.
The legacy of TASS journalists is more relevant than ever today, as the West increasingly attempts to rewrite history and fundamentally revise the political, international, legal, and moral outcomes of the great victory in World War II. The role of our country in defeating the enemy is deliberately downplayed. The blood-soaked crimes of the Nazis and their collaborationist lackeys are being whitewashed. The very principle of outlawing the hateful ideology of Nazism is being undermined. Let me remind you that this principle is among the foundational pillars of the post-war world order, the so-called Yalta-Potsdam system.
So you see in there that he's making a number of comments here. But again, this is all, for those who may not know, this is all leading up to a big celebration that's going to be in Red Square on May the 9th. They call it Victory Day, and it's annually celebrated. But this one's a little bit bigger because it's the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II for the Russians. And so it's going to be a little bigger than normal just because of, it's a decade long, it's a decade dynamic issue. So, of course, being the 80th, it's going to be bigger. But they're not just talking about the victory. They're talking simultaneously about two things that I think are really important here. And these are common themes. This is not just the only time I've seen this on the Russian press. Is the first one that he's talking about, they're rewriting history. There is at least a belief on the Russian side, and I think with some justification, that most in the West, and especially since this war broke out in 2022, downplay the Russian role in it. That basically, we won the World War II. Our forces came in and drove the Nazis out of Africa. We drove them up the peninsula in Italy. And then, of course, the D-Day landings and the roll all the way across France, et cetera, driving them up in there. All that's true. All that's real. We actually did that. It was very difficult, tough fighting. However, from the Russian side, that's because those successes were in large part because of the pressure on the Eastern Front. And it is by numbers. I don't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but I think it was somewhere around 80% of all German Nazi casualties came against the fight with the Russians, and 20% came against us. And of course, they had been fighting since 1941 when the Germans first invaded the Soviet Union. And we entered, it was, June 6, 1944, when we actually landed on the European continent. And it was 43 when we started in Italy and in Africa, North Africa, when we were fighting Rommel and all that. So those were after they'd been fighting for many years and had been deteriorated, degraded, and weakened, et cetera. A lot of their best troops had been killed. That's part of what the Russians say. And just looking at the numbers, it's hard to really argue with that, because then the Russians also had to fight Romania, the Hungarian army, the Italian army, of course, for a while, naturally the Nazi Germany itself. So they had a bunch of allies that they were fighting in, where ours were much more limited on the other side. That's not to demean anybody's contribution to the war, because it took everybody. In fact, that was one of the big things when the Yalta-Potsdam conference that he's talking about here is where basically the global order was set even before the end of the war. And that's when all the major powers got together and decided, here's how we're going to carve things up, and spheres of influence and all that kind of stuff. And that lasted for quite a long time, even through the Cold War. That has kind of pervaded. And now they're saying this is now starting to come unraveled, and the Russians are starting to look to having a new world order. It's already starting to come apart in their telling of this, and being rewritten with the BRICS. Now there's an new economic balance, counterbalance to the West, and now then they're saying even the military is. One of the other things, though, is that they are making an emphasis on the Nazi ideology. He made that comment there, because heading into this celebration, it's not just that we won the war, but now then they're saying it's this ideology that has to be eradicated. This is important, I think, because I think this is going to signal what the Russians are planning to do in this war. And you see that Putin himself, I guess a month or so ago, when he was talking on their National Guard Day, again, gave a speech to celebrate the National Guard, basically the local defenses and the border defenses within Russia. But he also made this direct and explicit connection.
You continue the heroic military traditions that date back to the era of the Russian Empire, were tempered in the battles of the Great Patriotic War, and following victory in the struggle against the bands of Nazi collaborators. I would like to address separately the National Guard troops participating in the special military operation. You are bravely fighting for our motherland, for our freedom and sovereignty. You identify and eliminate enemy sabotage groups and weapons caches, and you contribute to the restoration of peaceful life in the liberated towns and villages. I thank you for your loyalty to the motherland.
Now, that word he used there at the end, he used a couple of times in there, for the motherland. Now, in the United States, I don't think, or even in the West, we understand the significance of that phrase for Russians. It is like, and I've been told by some Russians that it's actually more almost a religious kind of connection. It's the essence and the spirit of the Russian nation. It's not just, it's not just a patriotism. It's not just like we might salute the red, white, and blue. It's probably close to that, but I think that it's actually a little bit deeper than that. We obviously have a very strong patriotism. I definitely do. That's one of the reasons that I joined up to serve in the U.S. military and fought in 4 combat deployments. So I was very proud, very patriotic, and wanted to serve my country, and even if it potentially was to cost my life somewhere. If I could do that to defend our country, I gratefully did it. Apparently, from what I'm told, from the Russian side, this whole issue of the motherland is even deeper. And Putin there was tying together that you're fighting for the motherland, for sovereignty, for our freedom, and for our future. So he's saying all of this fight here is existential. This is not coming in the first month of the war. This is coming in the beginning of the 4th year of the war, as we're trying to get to an end. This is after Trump has already been inaugurated, after they're working towards trying to find a peace settlement. These comments by the senior diplomat and the leader of the country are coming at a time when we're getting closer, as the one was earlier today. The video was released. I'm not sure when the video itself was filmed, but this is showing you where they are, where their minds are right now. Now, can you imagine where what kind of ideas that they have when they're thinking about a negotiated settlement? Are they going to be willing to have some kind of a negotiated settlement of the top that apparently Trump is trying to get, that Zelenskyy definitely wants, which is some kind of anything at all that's beneficial to the Kiev side, anything at all that preserves the territorial integrity of their country, wherever that border may be. I don't think anybody has any fantasies that they're going to keep the 4 territories anymore, but just how much is on there. But they're also wanting, and Zelenskyy has been outspoken about this, is that he wants his military to continue on in the current size that it's at, 700,000-800,000. He's actually talked in recent months about making it, accelerating it up to 1 million. not going down to 85,000, which is what the Russians have said is part of their requirements for negotiation. Certainly this denazification issue, which the Russians have said from day one and have now said again today or yesterday from Lavrov, they are still connecting those two together. And they are hearkening back to that spirit of sacrifice from the Soviet time when there was massive, I think they lost like 20 million people, never lost their will and their drive to win, no matter what the cost was, because even then they were talking about the ideology, the Nazi ideology had to be destroyed. Now then they're trying to make a direct link to that same mentality right now. And I think that they're setting their population up for, hey, we may have to make some big sacrifices, bigger than what we've made so far, because we cannot allow this ideology to continue to fester on the border. So what that tells me is that I think that there's a good chance that Russia is preparing to continue on with the offensive, that they are only going to agree to a negotiated settlement if it reduces the manpower, so there's only 85,000, that there's no NATO, and a declaration that there will be no military alliance, and that there is the denazification of the current regime, however they might define that, is part of the deal. I don't see any chance that Zelenskyy or anybody in Ukraine or anybody in the West would agree to willingly do that, which I think then sets us up for a military push to seize by force of arms all the things that Putin is trying to get to here. Now, Zelenskyy on his part is obviously way different from this. He's not at all thinking of making any kind of submissions. To the contrary, he continues to say, I want more, I'm going to push harder. And now then they have launched yet another incursion into Russia, this time in the Belgorod region.
Chief of Defense Alexander Syrsky has reported on the front line, our presence in the Kursk region and our presence in the Belgorod region. We are continuing our active operations in the enemy's border areas, and this is absolutely justified. The war must return to where it came from.
And his, I guess, a former security chief for Ukraine actually provided a little bit more depth and understanding of what the objectives are for this incursion.
The first and the most important goal for our military command to ease the pressure in East Ukraine, Donetsk region, WWII, where I mentioned to you, and that's why our, let's say, special operations, our, let's say, attacks on those border territories where Russia keeps the invaders, their troops are undergoing, and this is not a secret that in Kursk and Belgorod regions, our active operations of our military is undergoing. And the main goal is to, again, to expel, first of all, Russian aggressors, and again, to ease pressure at other, let's say, areas of the vast front line between Ukraine and Russia.
Ease the pressure. That's what both of them said. They wanted to ease the pressure. Zelenskyy had said that, he wants to have this incursion to take the fight back to Russia. That's the same thing he said about the Kursk operation. And by the way, since the Kursk operation, he has continued to justify himself and just claiming without any evidence that it was successful, ignoring the fact that after 8 months, they still have a toehold in some of the force belts that just on the northern side of the border. Those get reduced a little bit each day, but for some reason, Russia hasn't pushed hard to get it. They've just continued on with this methodical push, and now it's literally just a couple of just small bands of forest on the Russian side of the border, which almost certainly will be reduced soon, and then all evidence of what they had done was going to be gone. What they both said also was that this was to relieve pressure elsewhere in the theater. That's what they've been claiming from the beginning. We don't see any evidence of it. But we do see, and to be fair, there was a slowdown in the Pokrovsk area, especially in the last, say, couple of months or so. There had been a lot of progress up there, but then it came to a crawl and then really came to a stop. And it seems like the Russians were just content to continue having harassing fire, artillery duels, etc., along the front, but they didn't make any more pushes. Ukraine, for its part, several weeks ago, had launched a couple of local counterattacks to try and reduce a salient in the, the northwestern portion of the Pokrovsk sector. They made a little bit of inroads, and then those inroads were also wiped out. Every time you see Ukraine go on the offensive anywhere, whether it's a tactical or an operational like this one, they end up having some success at the beginning and then fall back. And that's where we are right now. So they still have a toehold in the Kursk area, and now then they've etched out a toehold in the Belgorod area. But these have less than 0% chance of accomplishing anything of lasting value for the Ukraine side. It's not causing Russia to have to redeploy forces elsewhere. See, the Russian forces are combined of a couple of different categories. They have one for their offensive capability, the ones that are in Ukraine now. Those are composed primarily, almost exclusively, of contract soldiers, professional soldiers, people who have signed contracts and have willingly signed up in order to go fight. And there's somewhere between 600,000 and 800,000, depending on who you want to believe in any given day. It's a huge number, and they're inside the Ukraine right now, or poised in some cases just on the Russian side of the border. But then there is also a conscription force, which Russia has, which are guys who were basically drafted, whether they want to or not. They're not mobilized or drafted. This is something that happens twice a year, every year, and they serve for 1 year, and then they're released. And these guys are the national defense, the National Guard that Putin referred to a second ago. That's where those guys are. So when you're talking about fighting inside of Russia, now then the National Guard is the one that's going to do that. So these 600,000 or 800,000 that's in Ukraine, you're not relieving the pressure anywhere. So then the question has to be, okay, if the pace of the offensive operation for the Russian side has slowed down in the last month and a half, and it has, it's continuing in some places, but like in the Pokrovsk area, it has slowed down. In the Kursk area, after a big push last month, where they had a huge collapse of most of the defenses, it has again kind of slowed down to this trickle hit situation. So the question is why? Why is it that that's happening? Now, when you take a look at what some Ukrainian people are saying, I think some people recognize this could be, and in my view, my assessment is it is the calm before the storm. We've been showing you, Gary, if you can toss that one full screen up there. This has been news out for a while from the Ukraine side. This is the Ukrainian, not that one, sorry, the one about the two-front offensive. This is what the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine has said, is that Russian armed forces will launch a simultaneous operation in Sumy and in Zaporizhia area. Simultaneous strike, big, on top of those 600,000 that's already on the front line in both the north and the south, with the potential objective of causing the front to collapse in one or both areas. So there has been, if you know what to look for, if you take a look at the nature of the attacks of the Russian side for the last couple of months, especially the last 1 month in particular, last 3 or 4 weeks, we have seen a shift in what they're attacking. There's a lot of attacks still on the energy infrastructure and on military infrastructure, on basically the operational rear. So maybe 30, 40, 50 kilometers off the front line, where there's troops concentration, where there are weapons, ammunition, fuel depots, et cetera, where they get logistics that go back and forth. Those things have been hit. In the near the rear, in the tactical rear, 10 to 12 kilometers, 15 kilometers from the front line, there has also been an increase in tactical strikes with drones, with glide bombs, et cetera, which historically especially over the last 2 years of the war, Russia has used to signal before they start an offensive, a big move. So they're basically making it difficult for the Ukraine side to move around. They're making it where there's nowhere safe for them. And then once they have weakened up the support structures behind the line, then they have launched in forward. That has been happening with more regularity over the last 3 or 4 weeks. Again, all the evidence to me suggests that Russia is preparing their population, that there is some big offensive operations to come, which could be very costly, that they're tying it to the patriotism, they're tying it to their history, to their World War II period of time. You may recall Larry Johnson was on our show, and he said that in the Russian side, as opposed to ours, there is a significant portion of the population that has some family member that had some kind of direct involvement in the World War II or lost someone. So it's not a distant memory for them. It's not even just watching like movies like Saving Private Ryan, that kind of stuff here, but actually family members are connected. So when Putin reaches in to grab those kinds of things and then pulls it forward to this fight, I think that tells you that they're preparing the population for something. If he was just trying to get this war over, our strength has just petered out and now then our offensive force is going down, then he wouldn't be saying those kinds of things. He would be saying things that like, okay, well, we've been really successful so far. We've got this territory here. He would be laying the foundation for, when I make this deal to end the war somewhere along the line of contact, that's something that you should support. He's not. To the contrary, he's saying this current line of contact is not our objective. That's not what we have to do. We have to eradicate what they call this Nazi ideology and the Western support. So, and some of the Ukrainian folks seem to get this. You may recall Alexei Arestovich, who in the first part of the war was a big aide to Volodymyr Zelenskyy and was almost a big propagandist for him. But after he began to see a lot of the things behind the scenes, many of the things that we talked about, it appears that he had a significant change of heart and then broke with Zelenskyy himself. He actually moved out of the country because he feared for his life. Well, now then he's saying, hey, we need to have this war over with. I guess in yesterday's news, or maybe, yeah, that was yesterday's news, he says Kiev urgently needs to negotiate with Moscow on the Finlandization of Ukraine. So, and if you're not familiar with that Finlandization, basically it's armed neutrality. And that's one of the things Doug McGregor was arguing early in the war. It may be too late for that now, but that was a legitimate possibility earlier, and he's still saying for it now. Why? Because he recognizes the truth, not what Zelensky's talking about. He recognizes that there is no military solution, and that if you keep trying to get more weapons, ammunition, buy time or whatever, all you're going to do is get more people killed and make it more likely that Russia wins. So he's saying that. And then he goes this is a few months back. This is in late December of last year. He went on the PBD broadcast and he said, hey, listen, I know that the West loves to demonize Vladimir Putin, but he's somebody that I think we can have a negotiated deal with.
From my point of view, Putin, upon completing the Leningrad University and working in the West, and he comes from political intelligence background, he is the most pro-Western Russian politician until now. His mindset. In his mindset, he is the most pro-Western politician. Let's recall his coming to power. His first proposition to the West was to accept Russia into NATO. Then he offered to make Russian missile defense system as part of the Western American missile defense system. He's the first leader who called George Bush after 9/11 and offered his help. He organized a stopover base for the US and NATO in Volga. It is the same person who today is saying no to NATO bases in Ukraine. And Americans, during their campaign in Afghanistan, were using Russian territory in their stopover bases in Russia. It took a long time before he switched to anti-Western courts.
And now that aligns precisely with what I've told you many times about the transition and how this war actually started 15 years earlier with that big seminal meeting at the Munich Security Conference in 2007, when Putin really just made a stark line. I don't know if you'd call it a red line, but it's certainly a line in the sand that said the advancement of NATO into further to the east is not going to be tolerated. We consider it an existential threat. That was the first time he really leveled that in a Western setting. And you heard just a few years before that, in 2001, you had Putin saying, "Hey, we're willing to, we're willing to help you after you were attacked on 9/11 for the United States." They were trying to show a lot of goodwill, and you remember, I think George Bush famously said he looked into the soul of Vladimir Putin and saw somebody he could work with or something like that. That's where it was back there. Putin was willing to entertain the possibility, hey, maybe we can join NATO. Because remember, in the immediate aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, once he took over, which I think was late 1999, Putin was saying, we need a new security architecture for all of Europe to keep everybody safe. That was what he was lobbying for back then. So he has long been, frankly, a very reasonable voice that says we don't have any interest in charging to the east. We don't want to recreate the Soviet Union. We just want everybody to be safe. We want us to be safe. We want our western flank to be safe. We want your eastern flank to be safe. So we don't need to have an expansion of NATO. But of course, we wouldn't listen to that. But you see, even all the way through, even when the NATO continued to expand, Putin continued to say, I don't like this, but we're willing to work with it as long as there is the red line of Ukraine and Georgia. Those two were declared red lines on the Putin side. And even as late as just a month or two before the war, he's still trying to find a negotiated settlement. He's still trying to say, just obey the Minsk Accords. And then if you don't want to do that, in December of that year, he said, all right, here's another plan. And of course, the one in Istanbul shortly after that. Everywhere you look, he's been trying to be reasonable and saying, I'm willing to work with you. Now, the West, for its part, has rejected everything he's ever done and ever said, and it's certainly since this war started, led by President Biden and then followed eagerly by all of Europe. At least now, Trump is again willing to try and reconnect with that. But the trust for all of Europe or all of the West is I think permanently damaged, and I don't think Putin is ever going to trust us to that level again. I think he has some trust in Donald Trump and is willing to work with him here. But I believe very strongly that even if he has some level of trust in Trump, he has no level of trust in whatever may come after Trump. And he certainly doesn't have any trust in the West, who is still to this day still trying to talk about strengthening the Ukraine side and armed peacekeepers, more support, military support for the Ukraine, etc. That probably is pushing Russia into a position to where they're going to say, "Hey, we will only stop fighting when we can physically assure our Western security. Once we have what we think is the minimum necessary for that, and then we will just have to wait and see how things evolve after that." So if the West changes its mind, or if it wants to come after, they then have defensive structures, which is why I think probably the Dnieper River is probably the minimum line that they're going to go to, because that provides a very strong military block and military obstacle that could be reinforced by the Russian defenses. That would make it nearly impossible or very, very costly for the West to ever cross. We'll see how that's going to work out there. But even Arestovich is saying, "Hey, listen, we need to make a deal now," because he recognizes that. Zelenskyy is the one who doesn't recognize it. And I think part of the reason Zelenskyy doesn't recognize it is because of some U.S. military leaders. I showed you a couple of different times from a Senate hearing last week with General Cavoli, General Chris Cavoli, who is the commander of the U.S. European Command. He was testifying on the House side today. And he, again, said some things which I think are contrary to where the administration is wanting to go. He's given his honest opinion and advice, which is what they're supposed to do. So I guess he gets credit for that. But nevertheless, this is not working out well for what the Ukraine message is receiving.
Russia has been throwing a lot of troops and taking a lot of casualties, particularly in the last month or two. Has that stalled across, you go from Kharkiv down to Kherson, basically the front, or are there places where Russia's making progress?
So Russia has stopped making progress in Kursk right now. They haven't been able to dislodge the Ukrainians. If we come all the way down the front along Chasiv Yar and the towns in Lugansk, if we go down to Pokrovsk in Donetsk, the Russians' attacks seem to have petered out. They've decreased in the last couple of weeks significantly in number, but the size and scope of the attacks seems to have petered out as well. The Ukrainians are in good positions. They're in good defensive positions. They've improved some of their readiness and manpower situation. They are indeed producing large numbers of Russian casualties. In a couple of minor places, the Ukrainians have actually gained some ground back, but I do not see the Ukrainians being in imminent danger of collapse. I do see the Russians struggling to make the kind of gains they were making last autumn.
So I told you a minute ago, and I've been telling you in the last few episodes, that the pace of the Russian offensive has definitely slowed down from what it was just 4 or 5 months ago, where it was significant over a large portion of the year 2024. The question, though, is why? Now, in General Cavoli's telling here, he doesn't seem to give any opportunity for any other possibility other than they're exhausted and the Russians are just running out of steam. And then he says on the Ukraine side that they have solidified their manpower issues, that they are, in good defensive positions. And listen, I just don't see any evidence to suggest that that's true. To the contrary, we continue to see over and over and over these videos that come out on Telegram and other social media where Ukrainian men are just grabbed off the streets. Gary has a compilation of a number of them here. Believe me, there are literally hundreds of these things that continue to pop up all the time. I was just communicating earlier today with someone who was a former high-ranking official in the Zelenskyy administration, and they confirmed to me that this continues to go on at a large, much more than reported basis, that they do not get enough troops to make up for their losses. that these recruiting drives that they're having with now 18-year-olds, they're trying to recruit them. They haven't force mobilized them yet, but they said it's just a trickle. It's a small number. And why would it be any different? Who wants to, doesn't matter what kind of money you make if your chances of dying are very, very high, like almost certainly. And when you see that there's these operations that the Ukraine side is doing are just steeped in fantasy. This attack into Belgorod, the attack into Kursk, all they do is make your troops die faster. If Russia moves some troops around, so what is the value of that? If, as that former security official in Ukraine said a minute ago, after I showed you the Zelenskyy claim of what this was accomplishing, even if it did cause Russia to move some troops from one place to another, what does that do for your war effort? How does that solve your problem of the war? Because once the Russian forces move troops around and then they drive you out, like they've now almost done in the Kursk area and will certainly do in the Belgorod area, because you don't have the power to project force into Russia that would actually threaten anything. You physically don't even have it. So then what? Once they have moved the troops over, they've restored the border, and now then they can put them back where they want. So where are you? You've lost more men. You've had, because it's obviously a higher attrition rate if you're attacking into a defended position than if you're just defending your own position. So they're just losing men faster. And at the end of the day, they have lost nearly everything in Kursk, and probably within a matter of weeks, and maybe not even that long, they're going to lose everything that they have in the Belgorod region. And so where is your motivation to want to fight for this side? When you see rationally that you're running out of ammunition, you're running out of weapons, even what was still left over from the Biden administration has been freed up, and the Trump administration is allowing that to flow in. But folks, that's a small trickle now. It's just a trickle of whatever was approved really all the way back to that, I think it was May 2024, $61 billion package. This is the remnants of that just streaming out, just trickling down out. Once that's out, there's nothing else in the pipeline. Trump hasn't even broached the possibility of having any kind of a new military package. And even though the Europeans are talking a lot of trash about spending $800 billion between now and 2030, et cetera, look, most of that will come years, plural, from now. That's not going to do anything for the remainder of 2025. How is Ukraine going to hold on much beyond the summer? I mean, we had, Mr. Martyanov yesterday, Russian military expert. His assessment is he's not clear how the Ukraine army can hold on much past this summer, if even that, because of the manpower issue that's shrinking on the Ukraine side and growing on the Russian side. Remember also just days ago, the Russians had 160,000 conscripts that they have signed for this current 6-month period. That's the most since 2011. So in decades, they have the most now that they've had for a long time, certainly the most that they've had in this war. And you see that the overall number of active duty troops continues to grow. So now it'll be 1.5 million active troops. That's 500,000 more than they had at their entire armed forces when they invaded in 2022. And that's on top of whatever the number of actual casualties are on the Russian side. They are indeed steep. Most good signs or good sources say that the number of Russian dead is over 100,000 and wounded over 250,000 on top of that. So maybe even close to 500,000 of total casualties. And yet, despite those casualties, the overall number has grown to 1.5 million. So it's 500,000 bigger now than it was, meaning that all those losses have been overcome plus another 500,000 on top of that. So there is no shortage of Russian manpower. And of course, their military industrial complex is now cranking along at its rate that can sustain this indefinitely, this level of the war. They can continue fighting at this slow and methodical pace until they literally grind their Ukrainian army to nothing, or they may try. These reports that there's potentially a new two-pronged offensive by the Russians in the Sumy and Zaporizhia areas could come to fruition, and they could break through somewhere. And then, like I've said many times, once you have a breakthrough, everything bad is possible for the Ukraine side. There is no path to anything except more death for the Ukraine side. And it's just confusing to me how otherwise intelligent, rational people in the West cannot come to this conclusion. Even Arestovich did. And remember, he was like a propagandist for Zelenskyy at the first, but he came to recognize it. This other source that I have, also former Ukrainian high-level government official under the Zelenskyy regime, who was helping him in the first, also came to the realization also recognizes it. It is starting to happen. And also this source tells me that in the countryside, especially the closer in Ukraine you get to the war, the more that the people there are saying, you know what? I don't care who wins anymore. I don't even care if the Russians win and we're ruled by the Russians, because at least they see what the Ukraine people on the other side of the line, since Russia has taken over those areas, that their quality of life is better than what the Ukraine side is having. And so many of them are saying, I'd like to have that. That's not reported. I haven't seen that reported anywhere in the Western media. Probably aren't going to, but that's what I'm hearing from the inside of Ukraine. That's actually the situation here, meaning that, again, the fabric is starting to fray and to tear apart there. So we'll see if sanity finally reigns in here. We'll see, because I'm sure President Trump is aware of a lot of these things. I know some of his national security officials are. But how that works out diplomatically and politically, a lot of different factors involved in that. But I just can't see President Trump going down a path that he knows is going to fail and is going to keep going it. Because the longer this goes without him taking some decisive action, then the more that he'll be tarred with whatever happens. Because I can assure you, the Democrats will go to no shortage of lengths to say, we handed you everything. We gave you all this on a silver platter. We had Ukraine going in a good direction. They were on a path. It won't be true, but they'll say it. And then they'll say, and then you squandered it. You stopped the money for a while. You stopped the intelligence flow. And then when you turned it back on, it was too late. You didn't give any more. All these things that they'll accuse him of. They won't be true, because the war was lost because of the Biden administration. I'm just going to say that categorically. It won't be true, but it'll have some political resonance. So to avoid that, then, and maybe even not avoid it. You probably can't avoid that no matter what he does, but he can minimize that and can basically take the offensive into mitigating some of that by saying, okay, this is not going to work. You either, Zelensky, you either make this deal and whatever I'm willing to live with and whatever I've worked out with Vladimir Putin, or you and Europe can figure it out on your own. To me, that's the only path that has any kind of positive outcome for the United States. Positive political outcome for Donald Trump. I think that he needs to give Zelensky a deadline, because I'm sorry for those who are pro-Ukraine side here and hate what has happened to Ukraine. I do too. I hate it strongly. That's why I've been such an advocate that this should have ended in the Istanbul agreements, or should have never started, but for sure should have ended in Istanbul in 2022, because of the cost to the Ukraine people in this pointless war that can only get them killed. And by telling Zelensky, this is the deal, you either take it or we walk, then that will cause the Ukrainians, and if they know that they lose the United States, I just don't think their troops are going to continue to fight, because then they'll know for sure that the game is over. And I don't think that the European side has enough to offer anyway. We'll see where that goes, but I think that that's the best play for the United States. Before I let you go today, there's been another bit of news that came out yesterday that's hitting a lot of the headlines today, which kind of raised my eyebrows, because I got to admit I didn't see it coming, with all of these things that are going on in the United States, with the administration trying to cut costs everywhere. They're slashing the federal government. They're trying to reduce the deficit spending that we have in each budget, et cetera. All of a sudden, from the Oval Office, President Trump announces this.
We rebuilt the military during my first term, and we have great things happening with our military. We also essentially approved a budget which is in the facility, you'll like to hear this, of $1 trillion, $1 trillion, and nobody's seen anything like it. We have to build our military, and we're very cost conscious, but the military is something that we have to build, and we have to be strong, because you got a lot of bad forces out there now. So we're going to be approving a budget, and I'm proud to say, actually, the biggest one we've ever done for the military. We have things under order now, the likes of which we've never had before. We've never had the kind of aircraft, the kind of missiles, anything that we have ordered. And it's in many ways too bad that we have to do it, because hopefully we're not going to have to use it. But the military is very, very powerful, and it's going to remain that way.
Wow, $1 trillion. So while the federal budget is shrinking in all these different areas to save money, we're going to up the defense budget to $1 trillion. I mean, no country's ever even been close to that in the history of the world. Even if you have common, consistent dollar figures applied to different times, nothing's ever even been close to that. And now here we're going to be running potentially up to $1 trillion. listen, there's some questions that need to be asked about this. What is this for? What is it funding? What is driving the need to increase the defense spending to that amount? Just rebuilding the military, that's not enough. That's not going to cut it. We need some information specific, because the Pentagon has been a big problem with bloating that we've had for quite a long time, where we spend scads of money and just get gash in different places. We get nothing for it. And, that's why we can't pass a budget, audit. Our budget can't pass an audit. We don't even know where most of this money is going. And so just shoveling in a few bucket loads more is just going to make it harder to figure out where it's going to. The question's got to be, what is driving this larger budget? Is there some shortfall that we have? What is the strategy that you want? It is so vital. This is not a minor issue at all. If you're going to have a big defense buildup from that, or even if you just wanted to say, this should be an absolute, no kidding, bottom line requirement from every president every year. What is your strategy? What is your national defense strategy? If it is, to patrol all the world's oceans, if it is to whatever it is, to have 800 bases, 600 bases, whatever the real number actually is, scattered around the world, what is that supposed to accomplish? What do you want to accomplish by having all of these bases around the world? Or that we need to have presence in an X number of seas and oceans around the world in order to, you got to fill in the blank. You can't just say, we want to patrol the oceans. For what end? What is the value of doing that? What is the cost if you don't do it? If we have the ability to project power anywhere in the world, do we need to reduce our presence, physical presence, on a routine basis in some of these other places? Can we cut like by 50%, 75%, a lot of these foreign bases that we have, and our national security not be diminished at all? I argue that that's a true statement. We could do that, but there needs to be some analysis done in that. And there needs to be some serious discussions about, what do we get for our money here already? And then internally, do we want to be able to fight two wars simultaneously and a small one? Do we need to fight one big one? What is the strategy here? Because that should drive what your force looks like. Because if you don't even have a strategy, you have no idea whether $1 trillion is wasted money or if it's not enough, because it depends on what your strategy is and what you want to accomplish. We don't have one. Nobody has put one together as long as I can remember. Probably since the end of the Cold War, I don't think we've actually had a coherent strategy that's then tied to the budget and the military, so that we have a right-sized military to accomplish that strategy. We always publish a strategy, but it's completely separated, and no one ever makes the connection between the two. And so that's what needs to be done here. And if you're talking about bumping up to $1 trillion while you're trying to reduce deficit spending in the budget, then you have to have a very compelling reason why you need to do that. And it can't just be categories. It can't just be an Oval Office chat while you've got a bunch of reporters in there. This needs to be reported to the United States, to American people. It says, here's our strategy. Here's the force we need to have in order to accomplish it. And then here's how we're going to get there. Here's the number of ships we need, number of missiles, the number of artillery systems, the number of troops in the branches of service. And here's how they all work together. They owe that to us, because otherwise, folks, what you have is what we have had: a bloated national security environment to where the military industrial complex is just as happy as it can be. They get their pockets fat, and we get all kinds of stuff that looks good on paper, that briefs well, that they make great videos about, that has no connection to our national security. I argue right now that we are getting a horrendous return on investment for the money that we spend and the actual national security we have, because we are putting money in the wrong places. We're not putting money in the right places. And then our national security strategy that goes with it, how we keep ourselves safe, is disconnected from those things. And no one seems to be in a hurry to actually make those connections. And that is a problem. So we need to be paying a lot more attention as a population when we hear stuff like this, and it needs to do more than just raise your eyebrows. I think the administration owes us an answer to those questions, and I doubt seriously we're going to get it, but we're not going to stop asking those questions and trying to demand some answers as best that we can. because we're unintimidated and uncompromised. It doesn't matter who's in the White House. We're looking out for you. We're looking out for the American people. And we want to make sure that you get the news you need to make sense of the world around you. We're going to continue to do that. I want to make one final comment here, if I can find it without looking too silly here. If you like what we do here at Deep Dive, if you appreciate the coverage and the message that we have, please consider becoming a member of the channel and helping us with your support. It really helps make a difference. It allows us to get better equipment. It allows us to take other options and do other things, to reach out to other folks. A lot of that's not possible if we don't have any financial backing. We've been doing a pretty good what we have for a year and a half here, but we'd like to expand some capacities. We can do that with your support and by becoming a member. There's things that you get that others won't get if you do that, and we'll be very grateful for it. But anyway, that's where we are right now. I want to thank you for watching us today. Be sure and like and subscribe if you haven't on your way out, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.